Shocked to discover my husband's lover is a man, I fled to an orchard trailer. My escape exposed dark secrets and gave me a chance to rebuild. I was 29 when my entire world split apart like dry earth before a flood. My name is Celia, and for the longest time, I believed I was living the kind of life many only fantasize about. I had a fast-paced job as a traveling consultant that, while demanding, allowed me plenty of freedom to work from home or from the road. My husband, who I'll call Everett, served as a rising star in a financial firm, a place with tall glass windows and an air of prestige that dripped off every meeting and handshake he described to me. We'd been married for 6 years, though we'd dated for 2 years prior. We'd met in the most mundane of ways, at a friend's small engagement party. Funny how an unremarkable encounter could eventually sow the seeds of such vivid, painful memories. And painful it all became. I remember the moment I suspected Everett had changed. Nothing was said out loud, yet I sensed something invisible standing between us. His schedule started filling with more late meetings, social obligations, team-building events. Each time I questioned it, he'd look at me in this almost irritated way and say, "This is what it takes to keep moving up. If I don't show dedication, I'll plateau." But the frequency of his after-hours commitments became absurd. It went from one night out every few weeks, to multiple nights out in a single week. Perhaps I'm too trusting by nature, or maybe I was simply too naive. But I chalked it up to corporate culture. I'd remind myself that my own schedule was hardly typical, that my traveling for work might make him feel I wasn't around enough. It was easy to rationalize, and for a while, I resisted the nagging feeling something more sinister might be unfolding. We lived in a condo just outside the city. It was spacious enough for both of us to work from home when needed, yet close enough to the corporate offices, so Everett never had more than a 20-minute commute. I recall how we used to laugh about that short drive. He said it was perfect because it was too brief to ruin your mood with traffic, yet just long enough to give you time to switch into home mode. Aha! But soon, he'd leave earlier in the morning, come home far later at night, sometimes with the faint scent of cologne not his own lingering on his shirt. I caught that aroma once, a sharper and more flowery scent than his usual woodsy aftershave, but I let it pass. I told myself it must have been an office colleague's perfume, or just the city's swirl of scents. The climate of our marriage remained somewhat civil, though cracks started to show. We argued over trivial things, a mess left in the kitchen, a half-hearted question about whether he'd actually spent the previous night with colleagues. Whenever these spats escalated, he'd say something like, "Celia, you're hardly home yourself, don't lecture me." At first, I believed he might be right. I was traveling a lot for my consulting projects, crossing multiple states in a single month, staying in modest hotels that served stale coffee in the lobby. Over time, though, I realized I was home far more than he gave me credit for, and whenever I was home, I was truly present. Cooking meals, tidying up, trying to create a comfortable space. He, on the other hand, would vanish behind a closed office door, or whisk off to yet another client dinner. One evening, about a month before my personal day of reckoning, I stepped outside into the condo parking lot to grab something from my car. I noticed Everett's car door slightly ajar. Curious and wanting to make sure he hadn't dropped anything valuable, I opened it wider. Inside I found a glossy business card from a spa. One I'd never heard him mention. I didn't think much of it. I placed it neatly on the center console so he'd see it, assuming it might be a place a colleague had recommended. Now I wonder if that was my subconscious mind sounding a silent alarm, warning me something was off. I should have asked him about it. I should have demanded an explanation. Update 1. It was early spring when I discovered actual proof that snapped me from the realm of denial. I'd just come home from a 4-day trip, an intense series of workshops I was leading across neighboring states. My shoulders were aching, and my eyes stung from lack of proper rest. But I felt a tug of warmth as I fumbled with the keys, thinking how maybe Everett would be there to greet me, ask me about my trip. Instead, I found him standing in the kitchen, half distracted, his phone buzzing on the counter. He seemed startled to see me. I made some remark about how I'd missed him, and he gave me the briefest hug, then mumbled that he had to take a phone call. Before the door to the spare bedroom closed behind him, I glimpsed an expression in his eyes that seemed like panic. And that phone of his. I remember the screen lighting up with a name I didn't recognize. Natalie. He stayed in that spare room for over an hour. I pretended to watch TV in the living room. My mind was running in frantic circles, but I tried to calm it, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. When he finally emerged, I asked politely if he was hungry. He said he had a headache from a big day, that he just wanted to crash. I nodded, trying not to let the sting of his dismissal show. Then, as though I were some detective in a cheap thriller, I excused myself to the bathroom and discreetly walked into the spare bedroom. His phone was not in sight, but on the desk I saw a small note. My heart hammered as I inched closer. 2 lines. Missing you, Friday after 7. My mind stuttered, racing. Without physical proof, I would have tried to rationalize it. But that single scrap of paper screamed volumes. I felt my entire chest tighten. I carefully returned the note to its original place. A wave of dizziness rolled over me, as though the floor underfoot had disappeared. That note was enough. He must have heard me because I froze when he poked his head in. "What are you doing?" he asked in a clipped tone. I stammered some excuse about looking for a pen. He studied me for a moment, a wary glint in his eyes, then shrugged and walked back out. I wanted to scream at him right then, but something in me cowered. I needed more information, more than a note scribbled in haste. I barely slept that night. Everett seemed content to turn away from me, his phone face down on the nightstand. My mind conjured images of him sharing intimate dinners with someone else, possibly checking into hotels, exchanging secrets. Emotions roiled inside me, a swirl of betrayal, confusion, heartbreak, and that awful sense that I might be losing all sense of who I was. I had always considered myself confident and unwavering, but here I was, cowering in the dark, feeling powerless. A few days passed in a tense haze. He was in and out. My schedule wasn't too busy that week, so I was mostly at home, trying to tie up some remote work. Every time I heard his phone vibrate, I flinched. One late afternoon, I realized we were almost out of groceries. I decided to take a short drive to the store. I offered to pick up something special for dinner. He barely acknowledged me, saying he had no appetite. On a hunch, though it felt ridiculous. I peeked into the passenger seat of his car as I passed it in the parking lot. My heart lurched. Under the seat, there was a racy little piece of lingerie, wine red with a tiny bow. It wasn't my size, and I certainly hadn't been the one wearing it. The world seemed to spin. My throat felt parched. In that moment, there was no more room for denial. When I got to the store, I abandoned the cart halfway through the produce section. I was too shaken to make sense of apples or spinach. I drove back home, parked, but couldn't bring myself to go inside. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Eventually the engine started to feel hot under my feet, so I forced myself out. Stepping into the condo, I heard water running. Everett was in the shower. Perfect timing, I thought. I hurried into the bedroom, snatching random clothes, my laptop, chargers, anything I could stuff into a tote bag. My mind screamed that I needed to do something drastic. Yet I stopped short of leaving. Instead, I crammed my possessions into the back of my SUV, then pretended everything was normal. But inside, my chest was a storm, roaring to break free. When he came out, he wore a casual t-shirt and track pants. I remember thinking, how could he look so ordinary, so relaxed, when our marriage was disintegrating? A million questions raced to my lips, yet I swallowed them back. I managed to say, "I thought maybe we could share a meal tonight, talk about things." He glanced at me, unimpressed, said something like, "I'm going to meet some coworkers for drinks." My pulse hammered, but I forced a neutral expression. "Sure," I said, "enjoy." He left, and that's when I rushed into the bedroom, rummaged for his phone. Of course he'd taken it with him. I sat on the bed, breathing hard. Maybe I should follow him, I thought. Do I really want to see it for myself, see them together? Something about that idea made me feel ill, but I knew I had to confirm. I needed closure, or maybe I was simply thirsting for heartbreak on an undeniable level. I drove after him, keeping a few cars back. He did indeed pull into a bar downtown, its neon sign flickering in the fading daylight. I parked across the street, feeling like some detective in an old movie. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could almost hear it echo off the windshield. After 20 minutes I saw him come out with someone. My heart sank. It was a man. Tall, well-dressed, with a confident stride. They laughed, stepping close, closer than mere coworkers usually do. And then it happened. Everett leaned in and placed his hand on the man's lower back. A gesture so intimate it made my stomach twist. I realized, in that instant, that Everett's affair wasn't with a female coworker named Natalie or any woman at all. It was this man with the bright smile and laughter that made Everett's eyes light up. The lingerie, the notes, it all pointed to an affair, but I'd never dreamed it might be another man. I recall letting out a strangled gasp, pressing a hand to my mouth. All the color seemed to drain from the world. They walked to another car, arms briefly brushing. That's all it took to confirm my worst suspicions. I followed them as they drove across town to a small boutique hotel near a row of coffee shops and bookstores. They went inside without looking back. My eyes stung with tears. I wanted to run in there and confront him, but an overpowering feeling of humiliation washed over me. Wah. I felt small, unsteady, as though the foundations of my life had been built on sand. This was the man who used to hold me in his arms, telling me I was his greatest blessing. Now he was holding someone else. In a daze, I drove until I stumbled on a quiet roadside diner outside the city limits. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I slipped onto a bar stool. A waitress, older, with her hair pinned in a neat bun, asked me if I wanted coffee. I ordered black coffee and stared into its depths. My reflection glinted back at me, eyes rimmed with heartbreak. Eventually a voice next to me asked if I was all right. I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered individual, maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes. He'd noticed my tears. I managed a faint smile, replying that I was just going through something personal. He nodded, not pressing. But after a pause he offered a simple phrase. I've been there. He introduced himself as Ross. He told me he'd come to this diner often when his own marriage fell apart. There was something about him, like a calm anchor in a raging sea. I ended up admitting I'd found out my husband was cheating. The words spilled out, and he listened intently, occasionally nodding. He said something that lodged in my mind. We can't control how someone else breaks our heart, but we can choose what to do after. That single line lit a spark of resolve in me. A realization crept in that I didn't have to keep living under the same roof as Everett, collecting little scraps of his lies, waiting for him to come clean. I could walk away. Ross told me he had a small place out in the countryside. He was renting a modest trailer on a piece of land with a little orchard. There was a tenant living there who'd just moved out unexpectedly, leaving it vacant. If you need a place to clear your head, he said, I'd be happy to rent it to you for cheap, short term. You can let the dust settle and figure out your next step. His kindness took me aback. I didn't know him, but maybe that was precisely why it felt safe to trust him. He had no stake in my marriage or my heartbreak. He just recognized pain he'd once known himself. I left the diner that night with his contact scribbled on a napkin. The tears had dried, replaced by a quiet, simmering determination. When I got home, Everett was in bed, or at least pretending to be. The next morning, I confronted him directly. Are you seeing someone else? I asked, my voice trembling. He barely flinched. Why do you think that? He returned calmly, a guarded look in his eyes. I fired back that I'd heard rumors from a friend at the firm, a lie, that he was getting too close to a colleague. He stared at me for a moment, then gave a dismissive laugh. You're being paranoid, he said. And honestly, you have no right to question me about anything. You're always gone anyway. Maybe if you weren't on the road all the time, you'd see that I'm working my tail off. I stood there, stunned at his deflection. Every time I tried to keep pressing, he pushed back with condescending remarks, until my nerve broke. I retreated, feeling small, but inside, I knew the truth. Even if he refused to voice it, the evidence was seared into my mind. Update 2. A few days later, I contacted Ross and told him I wanted to see the trailer. We met at the orchard, a few miles off a winding country road. The orchard smelled of ripening fruit, the summer air thick with the chirp of cicadas. The trailer itself was small but neat, situated under a large oak that offered midday shade. Ross explained that it had running water, electricity, even a small porch. My spirit lifted a little as I imagined myself living in that simpler space, waking to the rustle of leaves rather than the tension-filled silence of the condo. You can move in anytime, Ross said. I felt grateful enough to cry. But I still had to figure out how. I knew if I told Everett I was leaving, he'd dismiss me or manipulate the situation. So I bided my time, carefully packing small boxes of my personal items each day while he was out, driving them over to the trailer. My traveling job made it easy to slip away with a bag or two and claim I needed extra supplies for a road trip. As the days wore on, Everett noticed me less and less. Sometimes he'd be gone all night, returning early in the morning with excuses about urgent business. We drifted so far apart that our shared existence resembled two strangers who shared a kitchen on occasion. Eventually the day arrived. I decided to move out while he was traveling for a weekend retreat. The night before he left, we exchanged maybe 5 words. As soon as he pulled out of the driveway, I sprang into action. I took my clothes, electronics, a few sentimental items, but left the furniture and anything we'd purchased together. Then I wrote him a short note. You made your choices, and so have I. Don't look for me. I set my wedding band beside it. My throat felt raw with emotion, but also something else. Relief. My chest loosened, my breathing became easier. I locked the door behind me, leaving the keys on the table. He could have the condo, the mortgage, the life he was building with someone else. I wanted no part of it. I wanted to salvage my own sanity. Driving out to the orchard, I felt an odd mix of heartbreak and elation. I was terrified about the unknowns of being on my own, but also electrified by the thought of rewriting my entire life story. Ross greeted me warmly and helped me settle into the trailer. It was snug, but it had everything I needed: a small kitchenette, a tiny dining nook that doubled as a living space, and a bed tucked into the back. I placed a few personal knickknacks around: pictures of family, a painting of a beach I'd bought on a trip once. The orchard's hush enveloped me, like a gentle reassurance that I was doing the right thing, stepping away from the chaos. For a while Everett tried to call me. I didn't answer. He tried emailing me, sending short queries. "Where are you? Please call. This is insane, Celia, you can't just vanish." He occasionally managed to sound like the victim, outraged at my abandonment. I let each message go unread after the first line or two. My heart needed space to heal. My mind needed quiet. At times the silence haunted me. I'd be sitting by the orchard in a folding chair, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, and a wave of sorrow would hit me, remembering how I'd once believed Everett and I would grow old together. But each time that ache came, I'd let it pass through me like a storm, eventually dissipating, leaving me feeling lighter for having weathered it. Ross introduced me to his sister Nina, who lived nearby. She ran a small produce stand down the road. Nina was vivacious, always full of boisterous laughter. She teased me gently about orchard life, saying it turned even the most stressed city dweller into a calm nature lover. She and Ross invited me over for casual dinners, letting me talk as much or as little as I wanted about my marriage. I never told them the full extent of the affair, only that Everett had betrayed me in a way that left me hollow. They never pushed for details, they only offered warmth and acceptance. In that environment, I found the strength to slowly piece myself back together. A few weeks after I left, Everett escalated his attempts to contact me. He hired a lawyer and filed for legal separation, presumably to protect his assets or possibly to create a paper trail. My own phone beeped with messages from him, some furious, some pleading. "We can fix this, you're overreacting," one said. Another was more desperate. "We were building a future, how can you throw it away?" Each time the nerve in my temple throbbed, but a flicker of anger also sparked within me. He dared to blame me for throwing away our future, as if it was my choice to sabotage our marriage. I ignored him. The orchard was my sanctuary. I spent my days working remotely, driving into town for client meetings, then returning to that quiet slice of countryside. It became my routine. Wake up to sunbeams on the trailer walls, brew a simple coffee, check emails, then go for a short walk among the trees. The orchard's rhythm soothed me, reminding me that life moves forward, seasons change, and growth comes even after the coldest winters. Update 3. Eventually, Everett emailed me to say he was proceeding with divorce papers. I responded politely, "That's fine, I have no interest in contesting, I only ask for minimal contact until the process is done." My heart jumped when I hit send, but I also felt a cool sense of finality. The divorce was inevitable. I saw no path for reconciliation, not after the lying, the betrayal, his refusal to be honest. I half expected some dramatic gesture of apology from him, but it never came. Instead, I learned from an acquaintance that Everett had quietly moved in with his lover, the very man I'd seen him with outside that bar. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt a faint, residual pain at how easily he replaced me. But I reminded myself that it was my choice to leave, and I was proud of that choice. Time passed in a gentle blur. I fell into a new routine. Ross and Nina became genuine friends. Some evenings Ross and I would share a drink, and he'd confide details of his own divorce, how he'd once thought he'd never recover from the betrayal. But he did recover. He told me that heartbreak, in its rawest form, feels like it will swallow you whole. But there comes a day when you catch yourself laughing at something trivial, and realize your soul is beginning to heal. His words stayed with me. On other nights, I'd lie awake in the trailer, lulled by the crickets, my mind drifting to the possible future that awaited me. I had no desire to jump into a new relationship. I needed to rediscover who I was without Everett's shadow looming over everything. The official divorce came through quietly, an envelope I picked up from a local post office. My hands shook as I read the final decree. It felt surreal. 6 years of marriage, ended with a few legal documents. But I also felt weightless, like a tether binding me to a painful past had been severed. I sat on the step of the trailer gazing at the orchard, taking in the richness of life's quiet details. The speckled light through the leaves, the dust motes swirling in the sunlight. I felt an odd sense of peace. Last update. A couple of months later, an incident reminded me that healing isn't always linear. I was in town buying groceries. I stopped by a small bakery to get a treat. While waiting in line, I turned and locked eyes with Everett. He was on the sidewalk outside, scanning the crowd. For a moment, I swore my heart stopped. We hadn't seen each other in person since I walked out. Panic fluttered in my stomach. He looked thinner than before, a bit more solemn. He spotted me through the window and started toward the bakery entrance. I froze. Did I want to face him? Part of me wanted to flee, but my feet were rooted. He stepped inside, scanning the interior until he found me near the pastry counter. We stared at each other in silence. Then he said quietly, "Celia, hi." I nodded, not sure how to respond. He asked if we could talk, just for a minute. I don't know what compelled me, but I agreed. Perhaps I wanted that sense of closure, or maybe I was just too stunned to say no. We found a small table in the corner. My hands were clasped around a paper coffee cup, and my eyes darted around. He leaned forward, voice trembling a bit as he apologized for the way things ended. He said he never intended to hurt me, that he'd been confused about his identity, about the pressure from his job, about everything. I listened, not knowing what to say. He insisted there had never been any plan to betray me, but that he'd fallen into a whirlwind with someone who made him feel alive in ways he didn't expect. I felt pangs of sorrow for the life we might have had, but also a quiet anger at how he'd chosen to handle it. He asked if I'd be willing to meet him again, just to talk more, maybe rebuild a friendship. "We shared so much, Celia," he said. "I don't want to lose you completely from my life." I was silent, studying his face, remembering the nights I'd spent crying because of him. I finally replied that while I wished him well, I wasn't interested in building any closeness. He looked crestfallen, tears gathering in his eyes. For a moment I felt a stab of pity. He muttered something about how he understood and that he'd respect my space. Then, almost shyly, he asked if I'd at least stay in contact. I avoided eye contact, saying, "Let's take things one step at a time. I'm not making promises." He nodded, said he was leaving the city soon, transferring to another branch of his firm apparently. He'd wanted to tell me in person. Something about seeing him so vulnerable tugged at my heart, but I also guarded myself. I remembered the painful nights of suspicion, the lingerie in his car, the note from that mysterious man. I forced myself not to get drawn into guilt or pity. After a few more awkward sentences, we parted ways. Back at the orchard, I felt shaken. I told Ross about it over a simple dinner. He listened patiently, then asked me the question that truly mattered. "What do you want for yourself, Celia?" In that moment I realized the depth of my own growth. Once, my world revolved around Everett, making him happy, supporting his goals, ignoring my own misgivings. But now, I knew I had the power to choose a future that nourished my own spirit. I wanted to discover new places, maybe shift my consulting work toward a fully remote model so I could travel for leisure, not just for business. I wanted to rebuild my own sense of identity. Ross just smiled and said he was proud of me. I nearly cried at his earnestness. My ex-husband emailed me a week later, repeating his desire to see me again before he left the state. This time, I didn't respond. I felt that any further meetings would only reopen wounds I was painstakingly trying to close. I'd found a fragile piece in the orchard, and I refused to jeopardize it. I even considered changing my phone number. But I hesitated because, who knows, maybe there was a small chance I'd want to send him a final farewell. In the end, I kept my number and simply ignored his texts. Time drifted, and eventually the texts stopped. With that quiet end came a deeper sense of closure. I breathed easier. I began exploring the trails around the orchard, stumbling upon hidden groves. I'd bring my laptop along, sometimes working from a picnic table Ross had set up by a creek. My consulting clients never suspected their advisor was tapping away in the middle of a countryside orchard, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves. In my evenings, I'd experiment with cooking simple meals. I realized I hadn't truly enjoyed cooking for years, having always felt pressured to rush home from flights and busy schedules. Now, I could chop vegetables without hurry, let a sauce simmer, sip tea on the porch as twilight fell. It was in many ways, the calm I'd always craved. A few months after my official divorce, I met someone new in the most unassuming way. I was driving along a back road, heading to meet a local client, when my car's tire blew out near a ditch. Frustrated and alone, I got out, rummaging for the spare. A truck pulled up behind me, and out stepped a warm-spirited woman named Maeve. She quickly offered to help me change the tire. We got to chatting, discovered we had mutual acquaintances in town. Maeve was a veterinarian with a home clinic about 2 miles away. She had that open, kind smile that makes you feel instantly at ease, and we soon found ourselves sharing more details of our lives than two strangers typically would. Something in her eyes reminded me of my old confidence. By the time we got the tire changed, we were joking like old friends. Over time, a deep friendship formed between me and Maeve. She'd invite me over to her clinic to see the animals, introduce me to her close-knit group of friends. Little by little, a gentle affection blossomed between us. It felt foreign, having come from a heartbreak with Everett, but also comforting. This was different. No lies, no secrecy, just two women finding common ground. I was guarded though, because trust was something I didn't easily give anymore. But Maeve's warmth began to melt those barriers. We started going on runs together, exploring local trails, stopping for coffee at a small cafe in town. She listened when I needed to speak of my past, but never pried. I found myself smiling more, feeling my heart lighten. It wasn't a rushing avalanche of passion, but a gentle, steady flow of companionship that lifted me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. As the weeks turned into months, I decided I'd stay at the orchard trailer at least through the year. Ross was pleased, happy to have a dependable tenant. He even teased that I'd become part orchard caretaker. I chuckled, feeling like that was exactly what I needed. A simpler life, grounded in nature, away from the swirling chaos of the city. My job remained stable, my remote consultations going well. My entire perspective on happiness had shifted. The orchard felt more like home than my condo ever had. Occasionally, a memory of Everett still haunted me. I'd see a certain brand of cologne in a store aisle, or catch a glimpse of a similar-looking man in town, and I'd experience a pang of recollection. Yet those moments grew further apart, like echoes of a story that no longer belonged to me. I realized, heartbreak doesn't vanish instantly. It recedes gradually, replaced by new experiences and new joys. And I was determined to fill my life with exactly that, fresh, genuine joys. Maeve and I never officially labeled anything at first. But we grew close, sharing dinners and easy conversations under the orchard's starlight. She told me about her dream of expanding her clinic, about her love for animals that started when she was a little girl rescuing stray cats. I told her about the places I'd traveled, about how I once believed marriage was a fairy tale, but discovered it was more complicated than that. She understood in ways I couldn't articulate. One evening, as a soft breeze rustled the leaves, she placed her hand on mine and told me, "You deserve so much more than the pain you've been holding on to." I felt tears prick my eyes, partly from relief, partly from gratitude. It was the first time I truly believed that moving forward was not just an option, but a beautiful choice. About a year after I first moved into the orchard, I received a letter at the post office. It was from Everett. He wrote that he'd officially moved to another state, started a new position, and was living with his partner. He apologized more thoroughly than before, explaining that he regretted not telling me the truth about his identity, his confusion, and his emotional detachment. He said he'd always care about me, that he admired my strength in leaving, and hoped one day we could meet and just talk like old friends. I read the letter twice, feeling a swirl of conflicting emotions. But ultimately, I placed it in a shoebox of old memories. I wasn't ready to respond. Maybe I'd never be. Life kept flowing, the orchard shifting from one season to the next. I watched the leaves turn golden, watched them fall and blanket the ground, then saw the orchard come alive again in the warmth of spring. My heart followed a similar pattern, shedding old sorrows and sprouting new beginnings. Maeve and I grew closer. She offered a gentle sense of support that I'd never known. I realized my notion of love was expanding. It wasn't about grand gestures or romantic illusions. It was about showing up for each other in quiet, consistent ways. The orchard became a tapestry of new memories. Picnics under the trees, laughter echoing in the twilight, shared cups of coffee on the trailer porch. Even with that newfound contentment, I never forgot the rawness of the betrayal I once endured. Some nights I'd wake from a dream where I was back in that condo rummaging for Everett's phone, feeling that dread coil in my stomach. But each time, I'd open my eyes to the gentle hush of the orchard, reminding me I was safe now, that I'd chosen a path of freedom. I allowed those memories to be a lesson, to trust my instincts, to refuse any relationship that forced me to question my worth. Maeve eventually moved from her small rented clinic to a larger facility she purchased, where she could house more animals. I volunteered to help with some business advice, given my consulting experience. We worked side by side, forging a deeper bond. Over dinner one night she lightly suggested that if I ever felt like leaving the trailer for something more permanent, she had a spare room at her place. I hesitated, because the orchard had become my refuge. But the more I considered it, the more I realized I was clinging to that trailer out of a lingering fear of being uprooted again. Perhaps it was time to let go of that fear. We decided to travel together for a weekend. Maeve had a short conference in another town and I tagged along to explore. During the trip, a peculiar thought struck me. I was no longer Celia, the consultant with the perfect marriage. I was Celia, an independent woman forging a new life, open to the possibility of love that was honest and supportive. On our last night there, we shared a quiet dinner at a little bistro. She looked across the table, her eyes shining, and told me she cherished me. My heart pounded, not with alarm, but with a tender warmth. I realized I loved her too. It wasn't the flashy honeymoon phase I once experienced. It was something calmer, deeper, and all the more precious. Back at the orchard, I spoke with Ross about potentially moving out of the trailer. He seemed almost disappointed to lose his orchard companion, but he said he was proud to see me stepping forward with confidence. We settled on a time frame, another month or two. I wanted to say a proper goodbye to that space that had held me together in my worst moments. During those final weeks, I'd wake up early to watch the sunrise filter through the orchard, reminding myself how far I'd come since that day I discovered Everett's lies. Each day, the orchard felt like it was bidding me farewell, urging me onward to a new chapter. One afternoon, I finally mustered the courage to write a response to Everett's letter. I told him I appreciated his apologies, that I was glad he'd found his path, but that I didn't see a future where we remained close. I admitted I'd moved on, that I was finding happiness in ways I never expected, and while I didn't hate him, I couldn't forget the pain. I thanked him for the good memories we did share, for the early years that weren't all a lie, and for unknowingly pushing me onto a road of self-discovery. Sealing the envelope, I felt a weight lift from my chest. It was closure, in the truest sense. When I placed that letter in the mailbox, I stood there for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over me. Memories rippled through my mind. Our wedding day, those silly inside jokes, the heartbreak of discovering he'd been unfaithful with someone else. But now, it felt like watching an old film about someone else's life. I was present, rooted in the orchard's gentle hush, ready for a new beginning. A tear slipped down my cheek, but it wasn't sadness, it was gratitude for having survived, for having chosen myself when the world crumbled. Eventually I moved in with Maeve. We arranged my minimal belongings in her cozy house. I kept working as a consultant, my days balanced between travel and remote projects, but with a content heart, knowing I'd come home to someone who genuinely cared for me. The orchard was never far. Ross let me come by whenever I liked and I'd visit often. Some evenings Maeve and I would walk through those same rows of trees, sharing stories and laughter, forging new memories in that special place. A year later, looking back, I realized how heartbreak had unexpectedly become the catalyst for my transformation. I learned that betrayal doesn't signify one's unworthiness, it often reflects the betrayer's own confusion or insecurities. I learned the importance of trusting intuition, especially when the evidence is right before your eyes. And most profoundly I discovered that life can shift gears in the most jarring ways, yet still guide you to a path that feels truer to who you are. I know now that if someone cheats on you, it's not your responsibility to fix them or bear their deception. You have every right to walk away and protect your own well-being, and in doing so, you might just find a future brimming with unexpected wonders. Whether that's the calm of an orchard or the steady love of a person who sees your value without reservation. The scars remain, of course, faint reminders of a painful chapter, but they no longer define me. They're proof that I survived, adapted, and chose a life that's entirely my own. I still occasionally receive an email from Everett, polite messages telling me he's doing fine, that he hopes I'm well. I reply only sporadically, with warmth but without offering a closeness I don't feel. I'm content with the polite distance. My life has moved on, branched out, and blossomed beyond the confines of our old condo and the illusions of that marriage. It feels like I'm living in full color now, while my past was a muted gray, and there is such beauty in the vibrant spectrum of possibility. Sometimes, I reflect on the orchard, the hush of dusk, fireflies dancing among the tree trunks, the sense of quiet dignity that place bestowed upon me. It gave me space to breathe, to cry, to rage, and ultimately, to heal. Without that trailer, without Ross's compassion, I might have clung to a failing marriage out of fear, humiliating myself with pleas and arguments. Instead, I discovered self-reliance and a new capacity to love deeply, without losing myself in the process. What can I say to anyone reading or hearing these words? Life may break you in half, but it also presents you with choices. Sometimes, heartbreak is the sharp nudge that compels you to stand up for your own worth. To realize that staying in a tangle of lies does nothing but drain your spirit. You can walk away. You can find a place of refuge, be it an orchard, a studio apartment, or the quiet support of a friend. You can embrace the hush of solitude and let it transform you. In time, when you're ready, the world might just open its arms to a love that feels authentic. Where no one conceals their true self, where trust is a warm blanket, rather than a threadbare rag. I don't regret the years with Everett anymore. They shaped me in ways I couldn't have understood otherwise. I was forced to confront parts of myself I'd neglected, forced to realize that my own happiness was too precious to sacrifice. The orchard taught me to ground myself in something constant and real, like the earth beneath those trees, unwavering despite the storms that pass overhead. If you find yourself in a similar situation, suspecting a partner's betrayal, discovering those hidden signs, take it from someone who lived it. Trust your instincts, speak your truth, and if the lies don't end, don't be afraid to walk away. You're not bound to remain in a situation that cripples your self-esteem or well-being. The road ahead might be lonely at first, terrifying even, but beyond that fear lies a freedom you might not have dreamed possible. You deserve the chance to discover that freedom, to reclaim the dignity and love you may have lost along the way. There is so much I could still say, but it all boils down to a simple reality. We have the power to direct our own stories. Yes, life may hurl challenges at us, shatter our assumptions, and crush our dreams. Yet in the midst of that chaos we can choose to rebuild, to rediscover the pieces of ourselves that we buried under someone else's expectations. Looking back, I see how heartbreak led me to a new world of kindness and honesty. My greatest wish is that you, too, find the courage to create your own new beginning, when life demands it. I'll end here, with gratitude for the orchard that cradled me in my darkest hours, for Ross who reminded me that I wasn't alone, for Maeve who taught me that love can be gentle and true, and oddly enough, even for Everett who inadvertently pushed me toward a future far brighter than the illusions I once clung to. Sometimes, the hardest lessons bring the most profound growth. Let the past be the soil in which your renewed self can flourish. That is the beauty of life. It breaks us so we can learn to heal. And once you learn that, no betrayal can keep you from finding your own light. I wish everyone who has ever felt the sting of betrayal the strength to choose themselves, to walk away from what harms them, and to walk toward what nourishes them. Let your hurt be the stepping stone to a place of deeper wisdom and compassion. Life truly does get better when you decide you're worth the effort of starting over. And if you ever wonder whether leaving everything behind is the right call, I can only say that sometimes it is the only call. The first step toward a far more honest, fulfilling existence. Here is the ultimate lesson my own journey taught me. You cannot spend your life trying to salvage someone else's choices, or contort yourself into an image that fits their secrets and betrayals. The moment you accept that another person's disloyalty isn't yours to fix, you set yourself free. Don't fear the quiet that follows. Silence can be a loving teacher, revealing all the truths your heart already knows. And once you rise from that silence, you may find, just as I did, that your life blossoms with possibility, sweeter and richer than you dared to imagine.